explain, what was Chirac's approach to the economy?
Well, it was sort of part of his political evolution that he was one part protectionist, one part liberalising, depending on which topics he was looking at. And it was something that, I mean, as Prime Minister, he had started some of the privatisations of major companies here in France that had been part of his philosophy before becoming president. But in 1995, he was elected on the promise of fixing what he called a social fracture in France, bridging the gap between young and old and division of wealth and higher youth unemployment, and try also promising to create jobs, boost purchasing power, familiar promises we hear from French presidents and have heard from ones both before and after Jacques Chirac as well. As we were just hearing from Doug, two major reforms sort of bookended his time in office. One was in 1995, attempted reforms of the pension system, the social welfare system, things we see Emmanuel Macron doing at the moment in France as it happens, resulting in those massive strikes, 3 weeks three-week-long transport strikes, which led to the government having to pull back on those attempted reforms. It happened again towards the end of his presidency as well in 2006. His government attempting to pass the First Job Act, which was supposed to be an effort to try and get more young people into work by giving them, loosening the labour rules for those under 26, allowing companies to hire workers with less labour protection.
That very famous CPE contract here in France, very controversial.
Exactly, and something that caused, a 3-month strike across schools and universities. Anyone who was either in Paris, and especially a student in Paris at those times, remembers just the massive mobilisation. One of the biggest that we've seen, and I don't think we've really seen anything quite like it since.
In the education system, yeah.
And across many sectors of society as a result. And it was something that really sticks out in people's memory. And it was a hugely unpopular measure, again, which got as far as being signed into law, challenged constitutionally, and eventually inevitably, or delayed infinitely. It never came into force, and because of disagreements with professional branches. And it was a real attempt by Jacques Chirac to liberalise those labour laws, something that really was attempted unsuccessfully many times, again, until we came to President Emmanuel Macron, who passed some of the biggest reforms of the labour market that we've seen in the past couple of years since he became president. So overall, you have this sort of mixed verdict. There were attempts to liberalise, which were beaten back partly because of the difficult political situation that Jacques Chirac found himself in, particularly after those, that failure of his first reforms, which led to that 1997 election. Under the Socialist Party cohabitation, it was much more difficult for him to get his reforms through. Interestingly, economic growth is actually the strongest under cohabitation of the 12 years that Jacques Chirac was in power. The other slight irony, perhaps, of his time in power, one of the other major economic reforms that was passed was the creation of the 35-hour working week, which created a political Cold War because it was something that was pushed by the socialists who were cohabiting with Jacques Chirac as president, who was very much against it.
And was perhaps one of the most iconic measures here in France.
I just add very quickly, and despite all of this economic stewardship, as you will, and this push for sort of economic reforms and the cutbacks, when he left office, a lot of French would argue that France was still more unequal than ever, festering inequality everywhere. You had mounting piles of debt. You had unemployment very high. So you could almost question, so was it all for naught in the end? And what will his real economic legacy be?